Hello and welcome. Today we're looking at Chapter 11 of Kernohan's Business Ethics, titled Free Enterprise and Global Justice, with questions like, is capitalism ethically defensible? Is self-interest our only obligation in the free market? And does free trade promote global justice or injustice? So let's take a look at some justifications for capitalism. Contractarians say that ethics are just enforced contracts between self-interested agents, which prevent cooperation dilemmas. And capitalism allows for this to happen, and so it allows everything to work properly. Rights-based libertarianism emphasizes property rights, the rights to buy, sell, and trade both goods as well as labor, and capitalism capitalizes on this idea. Economic utilitarianism is based on Adam Smith's invisible hand of the market, and argues that pursuit of profit leads to greater public benefits. However, there are also problems with capitalism. Market failures of the varieties of externalities, both benefits and costs, open access resources, public goods, and transaction costs that are not quite properly factored into the equation. So, what exactly is capitalism? Well, it's an economic system where the means of production, factories and so on, are privately owned, run for profit, and are run by market forces, not by central planning. And this means that businesses operate in competition, aiming to create value and therefore earn profit. The accountability is to the idea of fairness, everyone gets a try, negative rights, transparency, stakeholders, and social responsibility. In short, the keywords are property, free markets, profit motive, voluntary participation, competition, and limited government interference. So the idea is that the best ideas with the best product and the best value should be winning, provided that everything works fine. However, a major complaint about capitalism is that it creates inequality. Some people make it big and others go broke. But this is actually inequity, not inequality. Inequity is about differences in outcomes. Inequality is about difference in opportunity. However, capitalism does not see inequity as a problem. It expects unequal outcomes due to its merit-based competition. The very fact of competition means that some people will win and others will lose. And so long as everyone can compete, there is no problem, according to capitalism. As a way of demonstrating the fluidity of this system of winning and losing, consider Thomas Sowell's Wealth, Poverty, and Politics, where he says, among Americans 25 years old, only 11% have been part of a household whose income was in the top 20%. But by the age 40, 53% have been in that bracket. And by the age 60, 70% have been in households in that income level at some point in their lives. Even the top 1% of households has been reached at some point by 11% of 60-year-olds. Now that means that the different classes in societies do exist, but that the people are not locked in. Think of it this way. Why are you not making a six-figure salary right now? Well, because you don't have the skills or the experience for those jobs. But give it time and put in the right kind of effort and you can make it there. Your retirement fund is currently probably non-existent, but give it time. Assuming you invest $100 a month into the S&P 500, which averages a 10% return, that would give you about $684,000 over a 40-year period from an initial $48,000 investment over that time. So while people do win and lose, who is winning and losing changes pretty frequently. And that too is supposed to be a way of balancing things. Another fairly common objection to capitalism is that it fails to protect the most vulnerable, the disabled, the elderly, and the economically marginalized. And there is a kind of harshness to people who lose in competition. This is a problem because failures are not always part of personal responsibility. Luck certainly plays part of that equation. But still, we don't like to see people starving on the streets, and so we do have programs to provide help. That is, while we have a capitalistic economy, our government, like most governments, has at least some social programs to help offset the worst outcomes. In fact, Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid programs, which cover the elderly, disabled, and needy in particular cases, is the single largest government program in the U.S., covering about 35% of the total income of the U.S. government. Now, here's a question for you. We subsidize people with bad luck, like disabilities. But should we subsidize bad choices, like crime, addiction, and so forth? And keep in mind that the way we pay for these things is by taking money away from people who are actually earning it. Now, on the idea of global justice, let's start with an example. If Bob is one mortgage payment away from foreclosure, has lost his job, owes alimony and child support, and is $200,000 in credit card debt, how much should he be giving in charitable donations to the poor people of Bolivia? Your answer is likely nothing. So why not? Well, because Bob is broke. And if Bob were to make some money, he should start by dealing with the needs that are immediately connected to himself. Only once he has these immediate problems solved is Bob expected to reach out and start looking for people to help beyond his immediate circle. And in a similar way, the role of a government is to first protect its own people by ensuring that the domestic laws are properly enforced, and also by making sure that any external threats to those same people are prevented. Now, if you look at the U.S. debt clock towards the bottom right of the screen, you will notice our stats for homelessness, people below the poverty line, people without insurance, etc. And these are very real problems that are had by the citizens of this country. And despite our staggering $36 trillion debt, these problems are not getting solved. In fact, many are getting worse year by year. And this gives us our first problem. We are $36 trillion below broke. So how are we supposed to solve other people's problems when we can't solve our own? And in case you're thinking of something like, well, let's raise taxes on the rich, keep in mind that even if we took every penny of value from the wealthiest people on the Forbes 400 list, and if we managed to extract that value without it declining, which is a problem because when you start selling off stocks, the value of the stock goes down, but let's assume we can avoid all of that. That would all add up to only about $5.3 trillion. That's about $2 trillion less than it currently takes to run our government for just 1 year. That means that just raising taxes is not going to solve our problem. Sure, raising taxes may be part of the solution, but it can't be the whole solution. But the second problem is actually much, much worse. When we look at successful capitalistic outcomes, they will take a limited initial resource, sake of argument, Bezos' $300,000 initial investment, and turn it into $300 billion, plus another 1.5 million jobs, and so on. But when we look at the government, they take the insane income of about $5 trillion and turn it into a $2 trillion annual loss, while also not solving various real problems they're supposed to deal with. Meaning that, financially speaking, you would have to be insane to willingly put the government in charge of any project, given that the projects never get done and that the costs keep ballooning up. And yet we feel that at least some projects should only be run by the government, for example, the military. So this may be a case of the old Churchill quote, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried." Capitalism most certainly has major problems, but it is based on human freedom to voluntarily try and to compete. Of course, we need some guardrails to prevent people from dumping toxic waste into our drinking water, but that's about where we need to stop, at least according to the libertarians. After that, competition will sort things out. And this is, in part, Adam Smith's invisible hand of the market. But it's not just a matter of money, it's also a matter of distribution. Often enough, for example, government use NGOs to distribute the whatever it is that needs distributing. And when you give money to charitable organizations, you expect them to distribute that money either in terms of money or in terms of some sort of product to the people that they're supposed to distribute this to. But NGOs tend to run at incredibly high inefficiency. In fact, it used to be one of the major ways of laundering money. They have very high overhead and make very little impact. Now pause, I'm not disparaging all NGOs. What I'm saying is you should probably take a look at where your money is going. The kind of helping that they do also often creates dependency or is poorly implemented. And here's a very recent example. After the fires that burned down a good chunk of LA, there was an LA Fires concert held to raise money to help those people, and $100 million got raised, but nothing got fixed. And part of the reason why nothing got fixed is because the CEO of the charity that ran the process has effectively a 7-figure salary. And then instead of using the rest of the money they collected to help people, they distributed that money to other NGOs who also have their own overheads to pay for, and then they distributed it to even other NGOs who also have overheads, and finally the money that came down was effectively nothing. So that's your other set of problems to deal with. Now, the idea in capitalism goes something like this. Investment by the wealthy is what's going to drive the economy. So you start a business, you make money, you don't just sit on that money and hoard it. You take it and you reinvest it. You create new jobs, new services, something, in order to generate even more money. But in doing so, you are helping satisfy the needs of your community and you're providing jobs and all the rest of that. So one way of looking at this is in terms of actually solving problems. And a really good example of that are the UN Millennium Goals, where we aim to reduce absolute poverty around the globe, I believe by 50% by the year 2015. And those goals were met before 2010. And they were done by economic growth, not by charity. And this shouldn't be surprising because charity, although it's very important, alleviates whatever problem is happening at the time, but it leaves people dependent on that same aid for the future. It's one of those give a man a fish versus teach a man to fish issues. Now, that isn't supposed to take anything away from charity. Do help people wherever you can. But a more functional kind of help is a long-term version of help that allows people to no longer depend on aid for their success. So if we compare capitalism versus government, we'll notice that capitalism gives us market success of innovation, job creation, and efficiency, at least better efficiency. Government, on the other hand, gives us inefficiency, overspending at $2 trillion plus a year, and all sorts of waste. So in comparison, market is the best engine of wealth generation and distribution. Nobody hands out the money, but money does get handed out. One way to think of the relationship between government and the market is that the government is actually trying to put different constraints on the market. And as noted, we definitely need some of those in order to avoid toxins in the water. However, in plenty of other cases, the result is inefficiency. So what are some alternative theories? Our book gives us the Rawlsian liberal egalitarian position, which we've seen before, that says that inequality is justified only if it helps those least off in society. But one of the major critiques is that equal pay for unequal work is going to discourage effort. It will disincentivize the average person and the overachievers from working. Would you work 40 hours a week if the last 15 hours of that work would only earn money for Steve and would add nothing to your paycheck? Would a CEO work 80 to 100 hours a week if they stopped earning at 5 hours worked? And what if the reason that Steve was broke wasn't because of disability or something like that, but because Steve was a gambling addict with no desire to stop? How long would you want to keep subsidizing it? So, in conclusion, capitalism is certainly not perfect, but it is also not immoral in and of itself. Capitalism is a tool. You may use it to do all sorts of good, and you may use it to do all sorts of bad things. But what it does do is offer opportunity and dynamic wealth generation with market mechanisms that adapt far more fluidly than planned economies ever will. And in terms of its ethical obligations, capitalism prioritizes internal solvency and empowers individuals and local choice. Now, None of this is to say that you must agree with this analysis. Certainly plenty of people don't. But it is a set of arguments to think about and to meaningfully argue against.